Today I'm going to talk about one of the things I think is a major problem for building a small NAS. Now there's lots of NAS cases like the Johnsball N2, the N3, all sorts of them that take between 5 and 8 drives, and they have ITX motherboards. Now there are a couple larger cases that have come out with MATX support, such as the Sagittarius case that I reviewed previously. Great case, kind of big, but other than that, it's really good, and it takes 8 drives and has an MATX motherboard. The majority of the smaller NAS cases all take ITX boards. If you go on a site like PC Part Picker, you're going to realize real quick that they just don't make modern motherboards with 8 SATA ports on them, or even 5. Most motherboards, like this is just an ASRock board that I just happen to have as an AMD one, 4 ports, and that's it. You can cheat it by replacing the Wi-Fi card with more SATA ports, or getting an M.2 one. You can add a PCI Express card. What most people do when they get a NAS case is they get an 8-port SAS card, like this one. This is LSI one, kind of gold standard for home NAS HBAs. This takes up your one PCI Express slot, because the thing about ITX is that they always only have one PCI Express slot. This is your problem. You get a motherboard, you use up the one slot, and a lot of people want to do other things. They want to add more M.2, which takes up PCI Express slots. They want to reduce their power by not having an HBA, and there just isn't a way with modern motherboards. Now, I believe I have found what is arguably the perfect ITX motherboard for building a home NAS, which I will mention at the end, because this is a YouTube video. And yes, I know everyone just skipped ahead to the end and no one's listening to me now. But I'm going to go ahead anyway and explain kind of the options going from like a budget choice to up to like kind of insane and kind of in between. And then why I think this board in particular is kind of a game changer in that sense, because it's just great. Going back to this B550 Phantom Gaming board from ASRock, this hits most of your kind of standard motherboard stuff. It's got M.2, you've got your 4 ports, and that's it. And it's got, I think it's only got 1 gig Ethernet on this one. At this point, what a lot of people are looking for is just like low power. For that, there's lots of boards. Now, keep in mind there's variants of all of these. They kind of interchange the processor, the number of Ethernet ports, that kind of stuff. They all kind of vary ever so slightly, but they're all very similar. So you may not find this exact board when you're looking, but they're all close. This particular board uses the J6413 Celeron chip, which is a 4-core, 4-thread chip. This board I have here uses the N5105, which is basically another 4-core Celeron under a different name. And these boards are all very similar in that they usually come with multiple M.2, lots of SATA ports, a PCI Express slot that is a 1X in this one, and I'm pretty sure if you try and use this while you're using the SATA ports, they're bound together, so I think you get one or the other. They usually come with M.2 slots that are also cut down. On this one, I can't remember if they're 2X or 1X, but instead of getting 4 PCI Express lanes, you only get 1 or 2, depending on the boards. Again, there's like minor variance between all of them, depending on exactly how they're allocating the PCI Express lanes. One of the issues is that these embedded processors, they're like, low power embedded chips made by Intel, is that they just don't have many PCI Express lanes. Well, it has 3 Ethernet ports. I think this is actually a serial port. Or it just is some weird port, I can't remember. These are 3 2.5 gig ports. If you bind these together, even just 2 of them, you actually get very poor performance. It's under 2.5 gig because they're sharing so many PCI Express lanes. And this whole system is just sharing PCI Express lanes, because I think this chip only has like 12 lanes total. So that means you have to connect everything on it with only 12 lanes. Desktop chips have a lot more lanes available and a lot more features, but no one makes an ITX board that also has a modern CPU socket and actual good features for a NAS. They're always only 4 ports. I can't even find 6-port ones really. So you're just stuck with 4 ports. This particular model comes with 6 ports. How does it have 6? It has a J Micron serial ATA controller on it. You're getting limitations from that because this particular one is a 1X PCI Express interface, and it's 8 gig transfers a second, It's got to be able to transfer data from all these drives. Now 4 isn't so bad to go over that, but when you get to this other model, like you really start to run into just kind of brick walls where you're trying to cram too many serial ATA ports into a cheap controller. Although this board has a lot of the features, they're often cut down. Like I said, it's got PCI Express slot, it's cut down, M.2, cut down in speed. Processor's pretty weak, but it's low power. This one and this one idle around the same 18 watts. That's with an SSD hooked up and a couple fans and memory and all that. You're not going to be running a lot of VMs on this with only 4 cores. If you want to do anything beyond just a simple NAS, which this is good for, it just kind of falls apart because you just don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the processing power. They're kind of just cheating with all the PCI Express lanes to get as many features on the board, like lots of Ethernet. Because they tend to be sharing lanes, you don't necessarily get all the features at the same time. Moving on to this board, which is kind of an odd one because it has 12 SATA ports. This one has, again, weird limitations because it's like older platforms, because these are, I believe, based on the 10th gen Intel chips. It has a single M.2 and then dual controllers for the SATA ports. This is the N5105 CPU, I believe. This one, for some reason, only has one RAM slot, which is really weird. You gotta watch out for that. A lot of motherboards that are in this segment just randomly have 1 or 2 slots. The other one I showed previously has 2. This one, for whatever reason, they only put 1 channel of memory on it, so you're limited to 16. You might be able to get 32 gig SODIMMs, but still, you're limiting yourself in speed as well because it's only in single channel mode. These often come with internal USB ports for booting, although that's not really recommended for most OSs. This one has dual gigabit Ethernet ports and kind of like a weird assortment of ports like audio and stuff. I don't know why all these boards have audio on them. Whatever. They make weird decisions sometimes. Low power board, if all you're doing is hooking up a whole bunch of hard drives and you just need to back them up, this works really well. They're relatively cheap. They're like $125 or something. And you get 12 ports. Yeah, they're sharing PCI Express lanes and stuff. You're just backing up stuff and you're limited by the Ethernet port. One way to get around the networking limitations, because no one puts 10 gig Ethernet on ITX boards anymore. I think there were a few older generations that did, but nothing current. You're kind of stuck using a slot, but you may not want to. So you can get a weird board like this, which is an AMD motherboard that takes an Intel cooler and has Thunderbolt. On this board, you still only get the 4 SATA ports and it only has gigabit Ethernet. But because it has Thunderbolt, you can get an external Thunderbolt Ethernet adapter for about 150 bucks. And this will give you full 10 gig speeds, and it works with true NAS, no problem. It's the only thing I've tested it on. I actually use this motherboard setup for my FireSafe NAS. I have a kind of largish FireSafe, so I was able to put an N2 case in there with a proper computer and just plug it into the network, replicate via TrueNAS, and then just pack it away. I don't really recommend this. It's kind of insane. This weird board is what I use, but it still has like some strange limitations on it. You still have the SATA ports. You're down to 1 M.2. It's kind of weird. I don't really recommend it. It's just what I ended up with. Now on to what I think is the best ITX board if you need to do more than just transfer file. If you want to run VM, if you want lots of processing power for whatever it is you're doing, probably VMs. If you need lots of cores for that, PCI Express stuff like fast SSDs, lots of SSDs, or just lots of SATA ports that are full speed and come with a lot of processing, I think this is unbeatable right now. These are made by CWWK, which is a pretty well-known like mini PC manufacturer and motherboard manufacturer. They make a whole bunch of different stuff. I think one of these is made by them. And I also have a mini PC that is a like all-in-one 6 Ethernet port system that I use. I run Proxmox on it. It has my router on it and Home Assistant. They make good stuff, in my experience. I got it through Amazon, and I got it pretty quickly in like a week or so. Now, they make 2 versions of this board. There is an H670 and a Q670. This board is specifically called the CW-H670-NAS, and there's the Q. The difference between the two is about $10, $20, and the only difference is that they change one of the Ethernet ports and the chipset to allow you to use Intel vPro, which means you can use an IPMI-like remote management system through one of the Ethernet ports. Other than that, they're identical. If you don't want to use the remote management thing, you don't need it. You can just save the money. They're identical boards. But what makes these special, modern LGA 1700. It'll take 12th gen, 13th gen, 14th gen chips, 8 SATA ports, all connected to the CPU. They're all full 6 gigabit. They all just run off the motherboard, so there's no compatibility issues. Full PCI Express 5.0 16x slot. This is a 5.0 4x M.2 slot. On the bottom, there are 2 more full 4x 4.0 M.2 slots. So you get 3 M.2s just on the motherboard itself, like out of the box. It takes standard LGA 1700 coolers. I know I have a 1U one on it. That was just, so I'm thinking of putting this into a 1U case. DDR5 memory, so it's faster. The catch is that it costs more. It has dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet that you can bond together in Linux, such as Proxmox. In my testing, binding these together in Linux using round robin, I was getting around 4.5 gigabit as opposed to just 2.5, so that's pretty good. I would say these are basically nearly perfect motherboards. The only thing that you have to watch out for is their VRMs are pretty weak, so they recommend against going to like the higher TDP chips and sticking with the T series, which are kind of lower TDP chips. They're kind of reduced clock speeds. They specifically recommend the 13500T, which is what I'm running in this one. It's 20 threads, low power. It also has the advantage of being able to support vPro. You cannot go below X500. You can't get a 12400, you can't get a 14400, 500 or up. Again, if you don't get the Q version, doesn't matter. You can get whatever chip you want. Don't throw like a 13900K in here because it just doesn't have the VRM for it. And they tell you off the bat that it's just not recommended. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have 2 of them? And they're actually the 2 different models. This is the H and this is the Q. The reason is, when I got this one, I immediately contacted them. I said, hey, why did I get a motherboard that says H670 on it? And they told me they're both the same. This one supports vPro, which is a lie. Just looking at the motherboard, this one has 2 identical Ethernet controllers. This one has 2 different ones. That's because this one has a special, it's like the I226LV or LM or something. This is what's required for vPro remote management. They did not put it on this one because they are different boards, and they sent me the wrong board and told me that it's the same. Now, I don't want to blame the company. I have no idea who the seller is. It says it's through them. Whether or not it's just some dude who's that just doesn't know or whatever, I don't want to really hold it against them too much. I'm just saying this in case you receive the model you don't want, let them know and just return it, especially if you're buying it through Amazon, they'll let you return it. No need to deal with that. Just be aware of it. Now, the reason why I didn't return this and have 2 is because despite having all these motherboards that I'm using just for this video and having updated the BIOS on probably 100 motherboards in my life, or if not more, I did something I have never done before. I flashed the wrong BIOS to this motherboard. I cannot believe I did that. I flashed the BIOS to the aforementioned mini PC, also made by them. And because they used just a generic DOS BIOS flasher, it just wrote it. It didn't care that it was the wrong motherboard, and it bricked the board. Power button doesn't work anymore. Nothing works. There's no BIOS flashback that I know of. There's no way to recover this. Due to the way it's electrically connected, the BIOS chip does not allow for just like clipping on and reprogramming, because you can just write the BIOS right back to the chip. I have programmed a new BIOS with the correct information. This happens to be a kind of difficult board to get the existing BIOS chip off due to the heat sinking, and because there's a lot of small components around the BIOS chip, I'm going to probably have to get kind of violent with it to get it off. And I will put this new one on, and hopefully that'll fix the board, and I'll just sell it or whatever. Don't do what I did, and don't flash the wrong BIOS onto any motherboard, because that's really stupid. Still can't believe I did it. USB-C, USB-A, HDMI, all the standard stuff, more USB. Audio. Why do they put audio on these, I have no idea. 2 Ethernet ports, both 2.5 gig. Like I said, you can bond them together in Linux. Works perfectly in my testing. And it also provides remote management if you're using the Q series board. The 5.0 slot also supports the 110 millimeter long SSDs from servers and whatnot. And there's even a whole bunch of LED connectors and stuff that you can run off if you're putting it into a rack case. There's an annoying buzzer in the corner that you can't seem to disable. There's also an ATX jumper. This is really common on embedded motherboards. These probably all have them all actually, where ATX means you hit a power button and AT means as soon as you connect power, it turns on. It's basically a auto power on button. Normally you configure that in BIOS. On these embedded boards, they tend to do it in hardware with a jumper, and that's basically it. It's a potentially very fast motherboard with reasonably fast connectivity, lots of M.2, really fast M.2, and a full 5.0 16X card. I do not believe you can bifurcate this. I didn't see any options in the BIOS for bifurcating this into like 4 NVMe drives. So you may be a bit limited there, but you can put a full graphics card in. You can have a relatively fast CPU, again, minding the limitations of the VRM, lots of SATA ports. If you have some kind of case that takes more drives, you can even add a disk controller to this and have 8 fast ports on it. It's really versatile, and I think it's pretty much unmatched anywhere right now for a NAS motherboard, just in terms of its like overall features, and considering it's only around $200 plus processor, obviously. I'd be really surprised if anyone's making a better board. Now, some alternatives are, there's a Ryzen version of a similar NAS motherboard. It's often called a 9X SATA motherboard because it's got 9 SATA ports, and they use little HD SAS connectors. That one I've looked at, and I haven't bought one because they're like $400, but they do come with a CPU. That one is limited in the fact that a lot of the socket, like the M.2 and stuff, are all reduced speeds. They're not full 4x. In terms of just pure PCI Express lanes, just maxing out a board, this is really the only game in town, I think, for a NAS that's 8 bays, like 5 to 8 bays. Now, I would love it if NAS manufacturers would take something like the Sagittarius that I mentioned earlier, add another row of drives and give you 16. Because I think that's a good balance. Where you get 8 ports here, you can buy an inexpensive 8-port SAS controller. You got 16 drives in a relatively compact space, but NAS case manufacturers just seem to do weird things, so I don't know. I had hope for John's Bow. That being said, I think this is an excellent board if you're looking at a decently powerful and expandable NAS board, and it idles pretty low. This one was idling around 20-30 watts. I'm sure you could adjust that with some settings, but that was just like in Windows, low power. Nothing wrong with them. I'm just saying, if you want the ultimate in ITX NAS board, these are it. This doesn't look safe, guys. My poor bonsai. Guys, one at a time, please. Hey, one at a time. You can get down.